Hey everybody, it's Kneecap here, and in this video, we're going to be going through an article on Wowhead for Rep Paladins, Retribution Paladin Rework in Review, AoE Trade-off Scaling in Patch 10.2. So this is basically the state of Rep Paladins as seen by Bolas. Bolas is the person who writes the Wowhead guide. He is involved with a lot of the figuring out the proper rotations and stuff like that for raid bots and stuff like that. He's a very important figure in the Retribution community, whether you know who he is or not. And yeah, he doesn't really make content or anything though, and there aren't a dearth of PvE Retribution Paladin content creators, unfortunately. I do the best I can, but he is one of the most forward-facing people, and we'll go through here and see what he says and see if I agree with it, if it's good feedback, and all that kind of stuff, and maybe expound on some things as well. It might seem a little strange to write an article about Red at the moment, given that there have been no new changes to the spec for a while. However, to me, this also makes it a pretty good opportunity for it, since due to the lack of updates, a lot of issues have become apparent more recently and are still unaddressed. With 10.2 fast approaching, here's a rundown on how the spec has fared in Aberrus, and what I hope to see improved before the next tier. Since the rework fixed a lot of the most glaring issues the spec had, past any throughput concerns. Ret has had some difficulties in the past with managing to deal with basic encounter mechanics and all content, since for a long time it was both one of the least mobile specs as well as having some of the worst defensive capabilities in the game. Now Ret is arguably one of the strongest specs in the game defensively, and the mobility issues have been sidestepped by the addition of the many range extension talents. Rat still struggles with knockback effects more than any other melee, but fortunately nothing that we've seen in Aberrus or Mujurso punishes that to the extent that Dathia or Razagat did in both of our incarnates. In terms of playstyle, Crusading Strikes has become the dominant build. Last few months it is more popular despite the large amount of downtime it causes. Personally, I enjoy playing around timed holy power games, so either Crusading Strikes or builds that hardcast Crusader Strike are both styles that I think are fun to play with. It does feel a little strange to play with Blade of Justice generating one holy power, but rotationally the spec is still great and miles better than being forced low impact buttons like Consecration. So if you don't remember, Consecration was supposed to be one of our main abilities in Dragonflight before they changed it. Overall, the rework did a great job of addressing the issues, keeping Retribution from seeing play at higher levels, and improving how fun it was to press your buttons. An increased popularity of the spec and a testament to that, although most of the rest of this article will be fairly critical of how the tuning has been. The design itself is great and can't emphasize enough how much more fun it is to play. The problem we've run into is that there's been almost no adjustments done since the release to address any of the issues that have become apparent more recently. So basically, he wanted to highlight the positives. We're thankful for the rework. This is something that I totally do as well. I always say, man, I'm happy for the defenses. I'm happy I can live, but there are some things that are still wrong. And I think it is important to do that as well, to be like, hey, no, the adding the defensive part was really good. Like you did a lot of really good things. And it's important to highlight that, because then if you just always say bad, then they'll just think the whole thing was bad. Talents. There's a lot to like about the new Rat talent tree, ton of choice nodes and well-designed interesting abilities, and you have essentially no nodes that are purely designed to roadblock you from taking talents that you want. You can just about take any talent you want from any position in the tree. It's a massively improved tree thanks to the rework. The biggest issue with it now is that since the rework, there's been essentially zero work done to address any tuning issues left since that point. There's a substantial portion of the tree that's just never taken under any situation in PvE, mostly because they're just too undertuned. Some examples: Judgment of Justice, basically everything that does your judgment. Righteous Cause, Sanctify, Divine Hammer, way undertuned. Judge your Executioner, and Divine Auxiliary. Not to mention talents like Justice Guard's Vengeance and Consecrated Ground that are clearly designed for uses other than Rating or Mythic Plus. So open world, PvP. I would love to have alternate builds focused around buffing Divine Hammer with Sanctify, or making Judgment much stronger with Judgment of Justice and Judge, Jury, and Executioner. But these talents are so undertuned that it's just not feasible to experiment with them. The talent tree is as it has ended up being pretty stagnant, with a single very obvious best way to build it for a single target. Little room for experiment with different builds past the Crusading Strikes, Templar Strikes dichotomy. For Mythic Plus, you have more leeway to modify it, but it ends up being the same 27, 28 out of 30 talents, with the last 2 or 3 being personal preference choices rather than genuinely new builds. The talents you don't take are just too much worse than the talents you always take to compete. So, completely agree there. The only thing real choice is Crusading Strikes versus Templar Strikes, or Crusading Strike, just regular old Crusader Strike. So, 100% agree there. This is something we've talked about on this channel. And of course, the only video I've done about talent comparison is really Crusading Strikes versus Templar Strikes, because there isn't anything else to even debate. AoE issues. At the moment, you have to really good reason to justify taking AoE talents in raiding situations. Yeah, every boss, you just do single target as Ret. On almost every boss, even bosses with substantial cleave like Forgotten Experiments or Echo of Netherian or Sarkareth, the vast majority of players will use a full single target build, even though there should be value in being able to do cleave damage in all these fights. The reason for this is twofold. Firstly, putting a point or two into cleave talents barely increases the overall damage you do. Secondly, the amount of single target damage you give up to gain any cleave damage is never worth the gain outside of basically a Mythic Plus situation, outside of just spamming AoE or like a council fight. On these types of raid encounters, the talents that you realistically take are Blessed Champion and Inquisitor's Ire, or Tempest's Lightbringer instead of Divine Wrath and Vanguard's Justice or Penitence. Any AoE or cleave gain there is small, in the region of a couple of percent. While there isn't enough incentive for players to want to run those talents, even when there should be opportunity to use them, since the potential gains are so small, the single target loss is usually much more substantial. Here's a single target damage loss you currently take from specking to various. This is good. This is some data, all of which are used AoE oriented buffs such as for Mythic Plus. So if you take Burning Crusade, Searing Light over Divine Arbiter, Executioner's Will, you get an 8% loss. If you do Final Reckoning over Execution Sentence, that's an 8% loss. Blade of Vengeance over Empyrean Legacy, that's a 4.5% loss. All other AoE, Tempest of Lightbringer, Blessed Champions, that's a 7% loss. In total, Ret loses around 22% of its single target damage in order to spec into AoE talents, which is about 30k DPS in our current gear. Anticipating comments that these numbers only add up to 22% percentages can be added together. Yeah, he's basically just talking about math there. Losing single target to gain AoE is not itself a bad thing. Here's just him comparing it to other specs. So Ret, obviously, by far the worst. Fury Warrior, the best, when you want to talk about that. Devastation, also very good. Basically, your single target and AoE is the same thing. Data used. In any case, it's clear that Ret is a massive outlier for how much it loses to gain AoE. It's the only spec that loses more than 20% of its total damage. Now, and here's my thought on this. So I'm fine with that, but then just make us the best single target damage doer. If we can't do both, then we have to at least be really good at something. We're not the best at single target. We're far from the best at multi target. We're like middle of the pack single target right now. It's going to go down. We are, bottom third or maybe middle of the pack for AoE, and yet we can't even do both of them. So it actually makes them both worse. It doesn't really make sense from any logical way you look at it. Why, in terms of what the devs are thinking, doesn't make sense from that case. And yeah, it's bewildering to me. These comparisons are all done with 10.1.7 numbers. Okay. So we're gonna move past that. I think that's kind of beating a dead horse at this point. We're gonna go to scaling. It's difficult to try to discuss scaling since it's a pretty nebulous term that people sometimes use to describe a few different phenomena. From my experience, when players talk about scaling, they more commonly are talking about how much a spec gains from an increase in stats or item level relative to other specs. So that's generally the concept. Yeah, that's how exactly what I mean when I say scaling. When I say Ret's not going to scale, it doesn't scale currently the way it's built. What I mean is that when I get higher gear, or when you get higher gear in the next patch, your damage is barely going to increase compared to others, right? So you get in this thing, you get in the new tier shoulders or something, and your damage is going to go up, 1,000 or something like that. Someone else, because of the stats on it, right? Because not only the main stat, but the secondary stats, their damage might go up 2,000 by getting the same eye level upgrade of shoulders, right? And that's what I mean. Despite no major nerfs or other losses, such as much weaker tier set, Ret has gone from comfortably one of the top DPS specs at the end of Volt to middling to low tier now. nearing the end of Abris. This is a pretty good indication that a similar thing is likely to happen in Major Cell, which it will, especially since the difference on atom level is going to be even bigger. I believe the main issue is that a lot of poor interactions with secondaries for Rat, for example, Critical Strike is less effective than it would be otherwise, since Hammer of Wrath, one of your hardest hitting abilities, always crits, and as well as Avenging Wrath providing a large amount of its regular cooldown. Mastery is now pretty bad since it was nerfed to almost 40% during the rework, to the point that it's just a worse version of Verse, since it only affects holy damage. The stats that Ret ends up using are defined more by the least bad option than actually having significant positive interactions with any part of their damage toolkit. Now, haste is a good option, but eventually that will diminish, and then we are left with no options. On the other hand, and it's not like haste is a good option in the same way that it is for like a caster class or something like that. On the other hand, the next tier set for Ret is certainly going to be better than the current one, even despite the recent nerfs to it. And Ret will also be able to use the new legendary weapon. So there's certainly some new systems that could benefit Ret more. As long as active tuning is done, it'll probably work out fine. But it's definitely concerning to go into a tier knowing what happened prior, especially when Ret was one of the lowest performing specs at high percentiles. So exactly, like there's been no tuning so far. There's no they did do some AoE tuning, but there's been no single target tuning whatsoever since the rework, and there is nothing preventing Rat from becoming the worst DPS in the game. Low skill ceiling, low skill floor. This is basically just talking about how, especially now, the rotation is quite easy. It's not the same as Shadowlands where you had to fit in everything perfectly. Just to barely get it in. Now you actually have like a second or two of clearance, at least 1 second, at least one global of clearance to make sure you get all your abilities into like your execution sentence. But let's see what he has to say about it. Ret is one of the easiest specs in the game to pick up and play it at a not totally awful level. The basics of the rotation are very straightforward, and even if you end up mismanaging your resources, your damage is not significantly negatively affected. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have specs in WoW that are friendlier for players who want something they don't have to focus on, as much as a decent output from them, or for newer players to have something easier to learn. And given the popularity of Ret, it makes sense to have it be one of them. However, past the point of learning the basics, there's a very little you can do to maximize damage. Managing your resources better and optimizing cooldown windows doesn't actually result in any significant damage gain, that's true. A cursory look at top logs for many fights will show many players manage to do very high damage, despite wasting massive amounts of holy power, or completely misaligning their cooldowns, something which would have been a real negative impact on your damage at any other point in the game. While it's good to have a spec, this is very, very true. So I'm actually pretty good with my holy power, and I don't even try that hard. But I'm like, I'm pretty good at it with not wasting my holy power. I've checked in the logs and everything, and yeah, and my cooldowns are almost perfect, almost 100%. And then there'll still be people that do much more damage than me, and they have like terrible cooldown management, and they waste more holy power than me, and like so like. It's like everything technically I should be doing better, but because of their beacon crit or whatever RNG thing happened, or their guild's just better, their group's just better. So yeah, it is a little bit. It does feel a little bit bad when you're playing really well, especially like if you have a pull where like you waste like almost no holy power. You do all your cooldowns perfectly, your rotation's perfect, and you still get like a blue or a low purple parse or something. And somebody has a higher parse than you that screwed up everything. The impact of this can be pretty clearly seen on log statistics. As an example, at lower middle percentiles, Ret is somewhere between average to very strong, depending on the specific difficulty of the counter you look at. At higher percentiles, though, around 90% above, Ret suddenly drops to one of the bottom performing specs. Essentially, a 20th percentile Ret parse is a lot more damage than a 20th percentile parse for most other specs, but a 99th percentile parse is much worse. I don't think there's a problem that can be addressed easily or quickly. I hope it's considered when any changes are made in the next expansion. I kind of agree with this so what we talk about on this channel, I'm going to skip his final note here. It's just him saying, even though I'm negative, I want to highlight that, overall the rework is good, but we need some stuff iterated on. But what I want to say here is, I think what he's getting at is the mastery thing, or it doesn't have to be mastery, but just there needs to be something reworked in Ret to have it scale, right? And you know, he said he doesn't like scaling or the word scaling or whatever, but something needs to be reworked in how we scale. And I think the easiest thing, and what we've talked about on this channel, is having mastery buffed back up a little bit and have mastery be something that we can scale with, to where at the very least, once we hit our haste and crit, you know, caps, once we hit those caps, we can stack mastery, and it actually has more benefit than verse, right? Than stacking mastery, than stacking verse. And so we can just build up mastery. Mastery actually feels good, and we can have 40-50% mastery at the end of an expansion or something like that, and have it actually feel good, right? And that could, and have that keep us, whatever, you know, tune it to whatever thing that keeps us competitive with other people. And so I think that's probably one way to do it. I don't think that's that big of a thing to do. I think that's something they could do in a patch. I don't think it needs an expansion for that in particular. But yeah, as we've talked about on this channel, they need to constantly tune Ret basically at the beginning of a tier and probably halfway through the tier, and since they didn't do it this one, we actually need like a double tuning right now, heading into the next year. Now, I say that because I am biased for Ret, right? A double tuning, like double the tuning, would put us back towards the top of single target, right? And of course, I want to be there, but you know, a regular amount of tuning will keep us kind of in the middle, right? And then, but by the end of the patch in 11.0, or not in 11.0, in 10.2, sorry, I'm thinking about the expansion. In 10.2, we're going to need another tuning. And if we get no tuning, like I've said multiple times on this channel, we're going to be one of the worst DPS specs ever in the game. Such a huge outlier that it'll be actually hilarious, because we do not get more damage when we get more gear. And you say, yes, I do. I got this much more damage, but it's compared to other people. It's compared to other classes and other specs. It doesn't matter if you got a little bit more damage. If you're doing 20% less than everybody else, then you are worthless in your group. And I can't stress that enough. If you are at the bottom of your damage meter in your group and you are 20% worse than everybody else, if you're doing tank damage or whatever, you shouldn't even be in your group, is the reality. And that's sad, but that's on Blizzard to tune that correctly to where that doesn't happen, right? And assuming you're pressing your buttons correctly and stuff too, right? Obviously there is some player agency as well. You have to do stuff correctly. But if you're doing things correctly, you shouldn't be doing tank damage as a DPS spec. And that is essentially what's going to happen if nothing is done. Now, do I think something will be done? I think something will be done. Do I think it'll be enough? I don't think it'll be enough, but I'd very happily be proven wrong on that. And I'd be very happy if they do something. So basically, I agree with pretty much everything he has to say. I don't think I think he downplays the scaling thing a little bit, because you know, it is a broad term, I guess. To me, it makes sense to just say scaling, but I guess to some people it could mean different things. So I do get that. But overall, I agree with everything he has to say here. I pretty much always agree with him. I think he's on point when it comes to Ret Paladin stuff. I always recommend his guide. I even, on my guide, I'll pull up his rotational things on the site to kind of go over the rotation, which I'll do again, I'm sure, in 10.2. Just to kind of go over it, because you know he's very correct. I do wish in some ways that he made content, because he has a more he would immediately have a good following if he did, and so I think he could do that. But these articles are content as well. I guess I should say that these articles are content. So hopefully Blizzard sees this. I'm hoping beyond hope, because Ret needs tuning. Ret needs help. Overall needs a bit of a more of a rework on its damage profile. Could be fixed with mastery, but there's other creative ways it could be fixed as well. So there's not just one solution, but it needs a solution. And so while I think Ret Paladins should be happy still with the rework, just like Bolas said, I think we should be happy with the rework because we have lots of defensives. We're somewhat useful. We have a raid buff, even if it's not great. Like we should be overall happy, but it's okay not to want to be the worst DPS spec, right? So it's a double-edged sword, and so we'll see what happens. They are starting to do a little bit of tuning, but ret just literally never gets touched. So we will see. Hopefully it happens. So that's it for this one, guys. Hopefully more ret paladin content coming. More will come if they actually do any tuning, and obviously there will be a guide for 10.2. But as always, I do ask you please subscribe to the channel. Helps me out a lot. And other than that, everybody have a good one.